خب فکر میکنم که بتونیم شروع کنیم. در رسم همیشه the floor is yours و در خدمتتون هستیم.
Thank you very much. I would like to talk about the origins of American literature, and in fact, the focus of my discussion will be on Washington Irving, who is usually considered as the very first American storyteller. When, of course, we say that he's the first storyteller in America, this, of course, does not mean that there were no storytellers before him. He lived in the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So, in fact, he comes quite late in the history of North America, if you consider the entire continent. But in terms of a distinctive writer who has the characteristics that we usually associate with American literature, he can be considered as the first in many ways. But before I talk about Washington Irving himself, I would like to delve a little bit into the origins of American literature. You know that the earliest English colonists who arrived in America established a permanent colony in North America at the beginning of the 17th century, around the year 1607. And this year, 1607, up to the American Revolutionary period, which is around 1775. This is usually called the colonial period in American literature. It's a very lengthy period of time, more than 150 years. And in this lengthy period, American literature has not yet found its distinctive voice. It is still a part of the larger British literature. So it is only after the revolutionary period at the end of the 18th century that we gradually that we gradually observe a distinctive American literature with its distinct characteristics. And that is why Washington Irving, who wrote in the so-called early national period, the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, is usually considered
فکر میکنم جناب دکتر
need to have,
یه لحظه قطع شدیم. اوکیه بعد.
Yeah. In order to understand some of the tendencies, not only in the works of Washington Irving, but also in the works of other early American writers, we should have at least some basic familiarity with Puritanism. So I would like to talk very briefly about Puritanism at the start of my lecture before I move to a lengthy discussion of Washington Irving himself and his works. So very briefly stated, Puritanism can be seen as a radical form of Protestantism, and Protestantism itself emerged at the beginning of the 16th century. And again, if I want to oversimplify things, I can say that Protestantism, I can say that Protestantism put a great deal of emphasis on faith and regarded the rites and rituals of Catholicism as irrelevant to salvation. And Puritanism is somehow an extreme version of Protestantism. So some of the major themes of Protestantism are first and foremost the majesty of God. There is a great deal of emphasis on in contrast to this, the depravity of human beings, the utter evilness of human beings is very much emphasized in Puritan theology and in Puritan thought. So in the works of Puritan writers, we see a very angry God in whose hands human beings are regarded as sinners. So it's a very harsh view of life. I mean, if we want to have a better understanding, we can perhaps compare Puritanism to the Salafi forms of Islam, extreme fundamentalism plus a very harsh view of human life. So that is, in fact, I mean, if I want to give you a very tangible picture of how Puritans viewed the world, I can give you such an example. So yeah, and some of the earliest American thinkers were Puritans, and we can see that the 18th century, in the colonial period, some of the greatest minds of America are Puritans. And I would like to briefly refer to Cotton Mather, the great Puritan theologian, who is also referred to in the works of Washington Irving, especially when we read the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Cotton Mather is associated with Ichabod Crane, one of the principal characters in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So I would also like to briefly talk about Cotton Mather before we turn to Washington Irving. Cotton Mather was one of the leading Puritan theologians of the 18th century, and he is a very fascinating figure from a variety of perspectives. He's also notorious for having had associations with the Salem witch trials, the Salem witch hunt of the end of the 17th century. Yeah, the witch hunt and this belief in witchcraft is something that is talked about in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So it would be interesting to have a look at the reasons why the witch hunt took place at the end of the 17th century. Well, first of all, we can see that the American community at this time is very tense after the glorious revolution of 1688 that had took place in England, because the entire community was worried about the succession to the British throne. And there was also a great deal of internal pressure within the American community, generational tensions and the Indian Wars and so on. So all of these psychological tensions exploded in the Salem witch hunt of the end of the 17th century. So yeah, I think that would be it. I mean, I just wanted to provide you with a very general picture of Puritanism, which is a very important intellectual strain before the American Revolution and before the time that Washington Irving started writing. But to turn to Washington Irving himself, as I said, he is one of the earliest distinctive American writers, and he wrote at a time after the American Revolution of 1775. You know, the period between 1775 to 1828 is usually referred to as the early national period. This is the time when America has recently been established as a distinct nation, the United States of America. And it has not yet, although it has become politically independent, it has not yet developed a distinctive cultural and literary identity. So Washington Irving is one of those earliest people who is attempting to provide the cultural independence that is yet to come in future years, of course, with the emergence of such great American writers such as Hawthorne and Emerson and Poe and other great so-called romantic writers of the middle of the 19th century in America. But let's talk about Irving himself a little bit. Irving, although has many distinct American characteristics, at least in these two stories that I will briefly discuss later on, Irving himself was a very cosmopolitan figure, and he spent most of his life in Europe. And in fact, it may come as a surprise that such a person is regarded as the earliest American storyteller, because, as I said, he spent most of his time in Europe and he was very cosmopolitan. He spoke several languages, and in fact, his writing does not have the characteristics of American prose. I mean, those characteristics that we usually associate with American prose, with the prose of Emerson. I mean, that sharp and somehow, I don't know how to put it, that witty and pungent and sharp prose that we usually tend to associate with great American writers such as Emerson and Whitman, of course. His prose has a rather British quality, if you like, but still, these two short stories, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, have very distinctive American themes in them. So I will start by talking about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is perhaps his most famous work, and has also been adapted several times. One of the most famous adaptations is Tim Burton's adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but as is usually the case with Burton's adaptations, it is very far from the original. In any case, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow takes place in a Sleepy Hollow, a place, a village that is quite far from the hustle and bustle of the new American society. By the way, these two short stories, both of them deal with the trauma and, thank you. Both of these short stories deal with the trauma and the existential tensions that the new American people encountered and were faced with after the American Revolution, and it deals with those tensions in a fictional form. So the story begins with a description of the village itself. So could you please go to the next page? Yeah. Yeah, could you please go to the next page?
I changed it here, but it didn't change. Let me just do it again. Is it changed now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So could you please go to, Thank you. If you could please zoom in on the 7th page, on page 7.
Okay.
The left-hand side of the page. Yeah. Just scroll down a little bit, please. Yeah. You can see that in the middle of the paragraph, not far from this village, not far from this village, perhaps about 3 miles, there is a little valley. Yeah. There is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull you to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. So you see that the description emphasizes the calm and tranquility of this rural setting, and this is contrasted with the new, busy, and extremely fast-paced life of the new American nation. So the next paragraph, if you please scroll down a little bit more, the next page. Yeah, the top of the page, please. Well, I will just read this out to you. I will read this out loud to you because it was in fact the previous page. If ever I should wish for a retreat, whither I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. So another very important description that we get in these early pages of the story is that the inhabitants of this village are very much prone to superstitions, and they are inclined to believe all kinds of high tales about witches. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs. If you just scroll down, please, a little bit. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs. Mm-hmm. Have trances and visions, and see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any part of the country. And the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. So in many ways, this is reminiscent of the atmosphere of the witch hunt. The people in this village, in other words, believe in superstitions, they believe in witchcraft, they believe in magic. So it's a place that still has associations with the extremely religious past of this nation. You can still find religious fervor and belief in superstitions and witchcraft in this village. In other words, this is a village that still belongs to the past. And then we are introduced to the two major characters of the story. First of all, Ichabod Crane, and then Brom Bones. It's very interesting that the description of Ichabod Crane's character associates him several times with Cotton Mather. In other words, Ichabod Crane is a figure who looks towards the past. He is a learned man, but learned in the traditional sense of the word. He knows about Puritan theology, and he's a figure who has read Cotton Mather's works. In fact, if you read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, you see that the word Cotton Mather, the name Cotton Mather pops up several times throughout the story in association with Ichabod Crane. So Ichabod Crane is a kind of intellectual, but an intellectual in the traditional and older sense of the word. He is also a storyteller. Could you please scroll down and go to page 11, the middle of the page. Page 11. This is page 13. Thank you. Just scroll down a little bit, please. Yeah, the middle of the paragraph, the cognomen of Crane. Cognomen means name, by the way. The first time that I encountered The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was several years ago, in fact, when I was still a high school student, and I quite remember that at that time I was struck by the great number of unfamiliar words that I encountered in this story. And still you can find, after all these years, you can find some words that you may not be familiar with. Cognomen, for instance. Washington Irving has a rather wordy and verbose prose. He tends to use unfamiliar words and phrases sometimes. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long sniped nose, so that it might have been mistaken for a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. You can see that there is a sense of humor and a kind of hilariousness to this description as well. And in fact, so his figure, his physique is quite awkward. And this awkward physique is contrasted to the muscular and lean physique of his antagonist, Brom Bones, who is a macho and masculine kind of figure. So if you move forward, I mean, if we read the description of Brom Bones' character, we see that he stands in stark contrast to Ichabod Crane. So if you please go to page 26. Yeah, yes, please. If you zoom in a little bit, please. Yeah, page 26, the bottom of the page, the second paragraph. Thank you. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Brunt, the hero of the country around, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short curly black hair and a bluff, but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and with the ascendancy which bodily strength always requires in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with an air and tone that admitted of no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humour at bottom. You see that it's quite interesting that this figure of Brom Bones foreshadows the classic male protagonist of later American literature and even many Hollywood movies. You see that Hollywood in its classic golden age in the perhaps 1950s and 1960s and 1970s usually has one of these male protagonists with a powerful physique and with many of the characteristics that Brom Bones is associated with. These two figures, Ichabod Crane, who looks towards the past, to the Puritan past of America, is contrasted with Brom Bones. So in a way, Brom Bones is somehow more representative of this new nation that has recently been born. Remember that Washington Irving is writing at a time when the United States of America has just recently become an independent political entity. So he's still trying to analyze what has really happened to this nation. I mean, where this nation is headed. And Brom Bones is in many ways representative of this new spirit, this practical and pragmatic-minded nation. And he's contrasted with Ichabod Crane, who is more cerebral, who is more intellectual in the traditional sense of the word. As I said, he's several times associated with Cotton Mather. I just learned that I have already talked rather a lot about this story, and I don't have much time, so I'm not going to read to you those quotations that illustrate the association of Ichabod Crane with Brom Bones. But in any case, these two figures, Ichabod Crane and Brom Bones, fight for the hand of a beautiful girl, the rural beauty, Katrina Van Tassel. And you can already guess the outcome. Brom Bones, who looks towards the future, who is representative of this new nation, is the one who wins her hand. And Ichabod Crane is relegated to obscurity. Ichabod Crane is, in fact, frightened away by Brom Bones himself, apparently, when Brom Bones pretends to be or impersonates the headless horseman and frightens Ichabod Crane away. And it's quite interesting, I think, that at the end of the story, we learn that Ichabod Crane himself has apparently renounced his old ways and embraced the new secular American way of life, because we learn that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time. I think it's quite important that Ichabod Crane studies law later on in his life, because law is perhaps the single most secular and worldly field of study that one can engage in. And it is somehow representative of a democratic country. I mean, it is a career with which you can advance in the ranks of a democratic country. So even Ichabod Crane seems to have renounced his Puritan legacy. That he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. So my intention in analyzing this story, in reading this story in this way, was to show that the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is not simply a Gothic story. It can also be read as a story that delves into the anxieties and the complexities of this new nation that had recently been born. It's a contemplation about this new nation. And in fact, it somehow predicts the outcome. It predicts the future of this young nation. And I also want to draw your attention to several features of this story. For instance, there's this tendency at the beginning of the story. This is what the narrator tells us. He says, for instance, he shows this yearning to retreat to nature. He says, if ever I had the chance to retreat from the hustle and bustle of urban life, I would go to this sleepy village. And this is in fact what we see in many later American works of fiction. Not only of works of fiction, but also of works of philosophy. For instance, Henry David Thoreau is the quintessential American writer who retreats to nature. So, we can already see some tendencies in the works of Washington Irving that become more pronounced and more powerful in the works of later writers. And this is perhaps more explicitly seen in his other short story, Rip Van Winkle, which perhaps more explicitly deals with the anxieties associated with this young nation. Rip Van Winkle, very simply stated, is the story of a person who sleeps for 20 years, who goes to sleep for 20 years and then wakes up when the whole nation, when the whole country has changed. And fascinatingly, he sleeps through the American Revolution. So when he goes to sleep, the country is still part of the British Empire. In fact, it's not a distinct country. It is still a province of the British Empire. But when he wakes up in the United States of America. So it's a story that explicitly deals with these tensions, these complexities of the birth of the new nation. Could you please open Rip Van Winkle, the PDF file that contains this story? Thank you very much. Okay. So please go to page 8. Yes, thank you. And could you zoom in a little bit, the middle of the page? Yeah, the middle of the second paragraph, we get this description of Rip Van Winkle. Yeah, thank you. He inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, hen-pecked husband. Indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity. For those men are most apt to be obsequious and conciliating abroad who are under the discipline of shrews at home. Their tempers, doubtless, are rendered pliant and malleable in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation, and the curtain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long-suffering. So, in other words, I mean, there might be some unfamiliar words here, but in any case, Rip Van Winkle is someone who has a very meek and pliant character and does not like to work at all. He's someone who is just the polar opposite of a capitalist mindset. For instance, we read about him that Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-oiled dispositions who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. This is in stark contrast to the capitalistic mindset that had come to grip this young nation. So in many ways, Rip Van Winkle is the polar opposite of many tendencies that had emerged in the young American nation. And in fact, the setting in which he lives prior to his falling asleep also tells us a lot about this change that this young nation has undergone. So, just a moment, let me tell you which page. Yeah, well, since we do not have a lot of time, I'm not going to read to you the description of the inn where Rip Van Winkle spends most of his time before the American Revolution. I will read to you the description of the inn after he wakes up, which is the time when America has become an independent country. It's quite interesting that before he goes to sleep, the inn is a very tranquil and calm place. Time passes very slowly there. People have a lot of time. They just stay there. I mean, just spend their time having idle talk. But then after he wakes up, the inn has dramatically transformed. And the description that we get of the inn after this transformation is quite fascinating. So if you please go to page 19. Thank you. Yes, the second paragraph, he now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn. This is after he wakes up. I mean, as I told you earlier, he goes to sleep at the top of this mountain in a semi-religious experience, which has been interpreted a lot, especially by Freudian and psychoanalytical critics. But that is not a subject that I want to get into at the moment, because I want to emphasize the political and the social dimensions of this story. In any case, this is after he has woken from his 20-year sleep. So at this point in time, at this point in our story, America is an independent country. It's the United States of America, and everything has changed, and everything is quite unfamiliar. And Rip Van Winkle can't recognize any of his previous haunts. Now, let's see how the inn which he used to frequent before going to sleep has changed. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn. But it too was gone. A large, rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats. And over the door was painted "The Union Hotel" by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall, naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag, on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes, the flag of the United States. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George. This is quite ironical, by the way, because even the face that he recognizes is a misrecognition, because this is not, in fact, King George. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe, but even this was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in the hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. So this is not, in fact, King George. This is General George Washington, the first president of the United States. There was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquility. So, as the narrator tells us, the very character of the people seems to have changed. People are busy. There's a bustling, disputatious tone about the way that they speak to each other, in contrast to the tranquil and calm way, these slow-paced conversations that used to take place in this inn. So everything has changed in this country. And it's quite interesting that this change is also reflected in a rather existential way, in the way that Rip Van Winkle himself sees his surroundings. Well, of course, Rip Van Winkle has slept for 20 years, so he's now quite an old man. But when he comes to the village, he sees a person who looks just like his former self, just like himself as he was 20 years ago. And this is in fact his son, who is Rip Van Winkle II. And then at this point, someone asks him who he is. I mean, someone asks Rip Van Winkle who he is, and the answer that he gives is quite telling. I think it's a very interesting part of this story. So if you could please scroll down and go to page 21, please. The middle of the page. Thank you. Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, could you scroll up a little bit? Yeah, thank you. Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity and whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. God knows, exclaimed he, at his wit's end. I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain. And they've changed my gun, and everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am. So this is perhaps the closest thing that you can get to an existential crisis in an early 19th century text. And it is quite fascinating that this change that has taken place in the American nation is reflected in this individual existential crisis that Rip Van Winkle experiences at this point. So we can easily see that a new era is at hand. But if we look at this story from the perspective of literary history, we can also find very interesting parallels between what we see in this story and what comes later on in American fiction. For instance, Rip is the representative of this eternal child. The eternal child is a character that we see in American fiction very often. Some of the greatest works of American literature portray this eternal child. Huckleberry Finn comes to mind, of course, Tom Sawyer, but also more modern, later 20th century American works. For instance, To Kill a Mockingbird or The Catcher in the Rye, all of them depict either children or teenagers who are somehow reluctant to enter the adult world. And in fact, American literature in its entirety has somehow been accused of being unable to deal with adult themes, to somehow abandon these teenage or child protagonists. So, I mean, the tendency of Rip Van Winkle to avoid work, to retreat to nature, to avoid doing anything that produces money, to avoid adult responsibility is very much reminiscent, or we should say predictive of what comes later on in American literature, the eternal child, as I said. So, and in fact, we can even identify some of the greatest classics of American literature, even those that do not necessarily or explicitly deal with the eternal child theme, as somehow being foreshadowed by Rip Van Winkle. Henry David Thoreau's Moving to Walden Pond can be seen as ambivalent. I mean, is he somehow trying to face reality or flee reality in the tradition of Rip Van Winkle? Rip Van Winkle also retreats to the countryside. He retreats to nature, to evade, to shun responsibility. So in a way, Thoreau can be seen as a kind of intellectual child of Rip Van Winkle, though in a different sense, of course. So in many ways, these two stories, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, provide us with some of the key tenets of American literature, and they explore this new emergence of this American identity in a very profound way, I think. So that was basically the gist of what I wanted to discuss. Though I just had to you know, to make everything quite brief, and I didn't have time. I mean, I at least thought that I do not have time to elaborate on certain themes, and I think that I could not do justice on some of the things that I wanted to discuss more fully, like the legacy of Puritanism and its importance for later American thought. So anyway,
I want to add something. If you need another session, it could be okay for us to just continue this session to another Wednesday, maybe next week. If all the guys here are interested and you are agree about that, we can do it.
Well, I think that there isn't much to, yeah, thank you so much. Well, I think that Washington Irving will not need a full lecture. I mean, will not need another full lecture unless we decide to talk about another figure in American literature.
I got it. It's really based on you, but I see that all the guys are agree about that. Anyway, yes, you can just summarize all the topics. So sorry about that, to interrupt you.
No, that's absolutely fine. In any case, yeah. So if we look at the story from an existential perspective, I mean, just to round things up, if we look at the story of Rip Van Winkle from an existential perspective, I think it can also provide us with interesting insights, because although the story has a somehow mythical setting, I mean, it has a mythical motif, the motif of the person who goes to sleep for a period of time and then wakes up when everything has changed. This can also be read metaphorically and figuratively. I mean, in certain periods of our lives, we feel as if time has flown and we have not lived our lives fully. We feel as if life has somehow evaded us and slipped out of our hands. And that is maybe a metaphorical or figurative reading of Rip Van Winkle's mythical experience. But now at the end of my lecture, since I still have a few minutes to talk, I think I can briefly refer to that experience that Rip Van Winkle has at the top of a mountain. You know, that at the beginning of the story, he goes to this mountain, he climbs this mountain, and he encounters several very strange looking people who have been interpreted by later literary critics as divine beings. They have been identified as gods and goddesses from various mythological traditions, especially Norse tradition. So he has this kind of divine experience, which again has been interpreted as an initiation experience. You know that in many sects, in many religious traditions, there's a kind of ceremony, a kind of rite or ritual in which a person is initiated into that rite, which means that the person learns some secrets and becomes an insider. So this experience that Rip has at the top of this mountain with divine beings has been interpreted as an initiation experience. So it is also symbolic of the experience of this new nation. This nation has also been initiated into a new phase of being an independent country. But of course, Rip himself remains unchanged after his encounter and after his semi-religious experience. So I think in a way, if we want to concentrate on Washington Irving himself, we can say that Washington Irving has a rather nostalgic view toward the past, and he did not approve that much of this new bustling, pragmatic and practical mindset of the new American nation. We see in both of these stories, both in The Legend of the Sleepy Hollow and in Rip Van Winkle, that the narrator tends to take the side of the past, to take the side of tradition, in contrast to innovation and in contrast to the pragmatism of the new American life. We see that the portrayal of Rip Van Winkle is quite sympathetic. He's a lazy and quite useless in terms of work person, but he's portrayed in a very sympathetic way. And we also see in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow that the calm and tranquil setting and atmosphere of the village is portrayed in such sympathetic terms by the narrator. So we can see somehow that Washington Irving seems to have a more approving perspective toward the past and has a nostalgic view about the past. And this makes it perhaps more ironical somehow to regard him as the first American writer, because as I said at the beginning of this lecture, he was also a very cosmopolitan person. So he may not have been the best candidate for being the first American storyteller, but in fact, he still has many things that make him distinctly American.
Yes,
thank you so much for, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's marvelous and wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, for sure. Is anybody has question, you can raise your hand, turn on your mic, or write it down in the messages for us to ask the professor.
Thank you for joining me, everyone. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
It was really a pleasure and a great honor for me to be a part of this. A part of these meetings, and I would also like to thank Ms. Tahiri for giving me the opportunity to talk and to give this lecture. And thank you all for joining me. It was such a pleasure. And I apologize for any inconveniences. If my internet connection was not the best, and yeah.
No, it's amazing. Thank you. It would be actually my honor and a pleasure for sure. And all the guys here, that's have you been here actually. It's amazing. I can see here, no question, just a pleasure and thanks your students and my colleagues here for sure. I hope
Thank you so much for your kind words.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I hope to see you more, maybe in other sessions, and thank you so much that accepts our invitation. It's amazing.
No, it was a pleasure for me and an honor. Thank you.
Actually, your kindness for sure. So nobody hasn't any question. Do you have anything to add?
No, that was basically it. Yeah.
It's amazing. So thank you so much. It's really amazing. And all of us really enjoyed that.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for your invitation. And thank you all for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for being with us up until now. I hope to see you soon. And don't forget to just tell me any questions about this meeting or about our workshops. We can hold it about entrance exam. See you soon, maybe on next Wednesday. Thank you.
Goodbye and good night.
Good night. Somebody's raised hand, or maybe mistakenly. Okay. Have a good night.